A slave narrative is a story either written or told about one's experience as a former slave that gives the reader insight to what life was like in their own words. The slave narratives of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs give an in-depth look as to how life was like in the days of slavery. Although the main storyline in these two narratives are similar, the personal journey that the authors went through are quite different. The two also address different audiences in their works, whereas Douglass addresses a wider audience and Jacob addresses a very specific group, specifically women. Frederick Douglass is a former slave that was born in Maryland. He was born to a white man and an African American woman. Throughout his narrative, it is suggested that his master is actually his father. He did not know his age and was taken away from his mother in infancy. In his narrative, it is said that his mother would come see him on occasion at night by foot after she had a long day of work. After he escaped slavery, Douglass went on to be an author and an activist. Harriet Jacobs was born a slave in North Carolina. She was a member of the Underground Railroad and successfully escaped slavery. She went on to open up the conversation about slaves, mostly women, being sexual property of their masters. She was a mother, an activist, and a fantastic writer. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs share the unfortunate fact that they were both born into slavery. However, they also share the fact that they both escaped slavery successfully as well. The two both write, but the stories are quite different. The writings of the two authors show what slaves had to endure during their lifetime. For Douglass, there's an emphasis on how physical size and strength were a factor in his treatment, and unfortunately for Jacobs, the fact that she was a woman played a huge role in her treatment as well by her master. Both suffered a great deal, and the narratives give a two-sided look at what life was like as a female slave and a male slave. Jacobs uses her narrative as an opportunity to address women, more specifically white northern women, about what life was like as a female slave. From a very young age, she was the sexual property of Dr. Flint. In the story, she gives herself the name of Linda, and throughout the story, Linda is caught in a position where she is having children with a white man, although she is a slave. And Mr. Sands, the white man that she has been sleeping with, promises her to free her and the children, but never really makes good on those promises. And although he treats her a little nicer in nature than he would other slaves, she still is a slave at the end of the day. Another man in Linda's story is her master, Dr. Flint, and he makes Linda his sexual property, and instead of forcing her to submit to him, he asks her permission to be his mistress. And Linda is a somewhat rebellious character in the story, and rightfully so. But Dr. Flint almost enjoys the chase, but still does not give her a break in any way. Linda is the mother of two children named Ellen and Ben, and as if being mother wasn't difficult enough, she is also a slave, and the children are also born into slavery. And Dr. Flint kind of holds these children over her head as a way to control her, but as Linda won't bend, then he has to come up with other ways to torture her. And upon realizing that she had given birth to a daughter, she says in chapter 14, "When they told me my newborn babe was a girl, my heart was heavier than it had ever been before. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women." Being an enslaved woman is filled with so many types of abuses, especially emotional, and it's seen in her narrative where she's kind of faced with a decision on having a home for her children and being able to be a mother, but in order to do that, she would have to submit to Dr. Flint and do whatever he requests of her sexually and otherwise. And all of that kind of goes against her Christian beliefs, and she's forced to make these decisions that male slaves would not have to make. And it just puts her in a very unfair position. And at the end of the day, all she wants is her children to be safe and not in slavery, and just to have a home with her children and be a mother. Ultimately, she ends up escaping slavery and Dr. Flint's dictatorship, and she's forced to hide in her grandmother's attic, which is a very tiny space, about 7 by 9, and it's obviously not comfortable, but it is much more comfortable than being a slave to an abusive owner. And you can really just see her character development throughout the story. In Jacob's narrative, we see that she's a mother being faced with the decision of whether to let her children be taken away or doing what's best for her, and all kinds of decisions a mother shouldn't have to make. And with Douglas, we see the other side of that, and he is the child that was taken away from the mother. And although he knows who she is, there really is no real relationship there. And he really doesn't know much about himself. And his masters don't want him to know his age, and everything is very secretive because they don't believe slaves should know that kind of information. In chapter 1, you can kind of get an idea of the clear divide between whites and blacks. And Douglas has a really hard time identifying himself, not only literally, but in any other type of psychological way. And he states in chapter 1 that a want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me even during childhood. And after he says that, he goes on to say that the white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on part of slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. Another way that slave owners would assert their dominance is by taking newborn slave children away from their mothers and just destroying that bond that mothers and children should feel with one another. And although he knew his mother's name was Harriet Bailey, he had no real relationship with her. She would come and see him on occasion, typically at night on foot after she worked all day. And it was said that his father was actually his master. And whenever his mother died when he was young, he kind of related her death to the death of a stranger. So Douglas was owned by two men named Anthony and Mr. Plummer, and both of these men were pretty brutal, but nobody was more brutal than Mr. Plummer, and he made that very clear, how violent he was, and depicted a lot of scenes of violence that no child or person at all should see in their lifetime. Douglas's first experience with how horrible slavery was when he saw his aunt get brutally whipped by one of the owners, and that's kind of like when it clicked for him that this was not normal, this was not okay, and this was not fair. Being that Douglas is the son of the slave owner, that would mean that the slave owner has a wife, and obviously the wife is not too pleased about her husband having an affair with a slave, and not just having an affair with a slave, but having a child with a slave. And he says in chapter 1 that they are, in first place, a constant offense to their mistress. She is ever disposed to find fault with them. They can seldom do anything to please her. She is never better pleased than when she sees them under the lash, especially when she suspects her husband of showing his mulatto children favors which he withholds from his black slaves. So in this quote, we can see that there's obvious jealousy that Douglas is having to deal with, and the wives are not happy unless the children are constantly being tortured, and they don't want them to have any sort of upper hand over the other average slaves that they own. Each of these narratives that were assigned were equally as horrible, but in Douglas's narrative, there's an extreme emphasis on violence, and in Jacob's narrative, there's not so much. There is still violence, but it's mostly sexual in nature, and it's far more emotional and psychologically damaging than what you can read in this first chapter of Douglas's. What's important to note is that Douglas was a very strong-willed man, and he always wanted to know more information, wanted to learn. He didn't want to be like the other slaves and not know how to read and write, and he was a very self-taught individual. And eventually he did successfully escape and went on to be an amazing activist and author. And because of that determination to learn, he left us with this great piece of literature that we are able to read today that just gives such a great insight as to what life was like as a slave.